Thank you very much. I appreciate it. And I appreciate the opportunity. Um, we're going to be using sepsis as a focus, but really what I'm going to be aiming for is how to teach any specialty topics. How this is going to be more about the education methods than it is going to be a clinical lecture about sepsis. So we're going to focus around sepsis as an example based on some of the programs that I've designed and the like. But really, you can take these concepts and apply them to the most fundamental programs that you're going to run to the most complex. What we're aiming for here, number one, apply the GNOMES method of lesson plan customization, which is all of our next objectives. And if you've heard of the GNOMES framework before, hopefully we'll give you some different ideas, different ways to apply it to really amp up the critical thinking, because that's what this is all about. But if you haven't, we're going to go through each step of it, from formulating an outcome-focused goal for a custom lesson, meaning something that you're building rather than something that's more or less prepackaged. How to identify and align the needs of instructors and students. How to, you're going to be able to, I should say, create performance-based objectives for teaching and testing. And that's in the middle, not just because I didn't put it at the beginning and I didn't put it at the end. That's in the middle because performance-based objectives are really at the heart of everything we do. If you don't have solid objectives, then you don't have a lesson, honestly. We're going to learn how to apply Monroe's motivated sequence for custom lessons to really help engage your audience, not so that the focus is on you, that kind of engage, but rather that they engage them with the materials. Especially if it's a custom lesson plan for something for which the students either aren't familiar with or believe that they've already covered, really know really well, and you have to teach them a new angle on it, or something that they don't feel applies as much to their daily work. We're going to help you be able to identify at least 3 teaching methods that support critical thinking, how to differentiate critical versus non-essential evaluation criteria, always important, and how to apply effective lesson summary techniques. And what I want you to be able to do, this is super, super important. And when I've spoken at the NAMSI Symposium, we've talked about this in keynotes and lessons. I've found the more that I teach that it's about articulation. And I'm not just talking about being eloquent when you're teaching. I'm talking about when you write down a lesson plan, actually writing it down, making yourself write something down. Now, it could just be scribbled on a notepad. That's fine. I keep pads like this all over the place so that I can write stuff down on them. But what I've found is that, especially the more experienced I get as a clinician and as an educator, I feel it. I feel I got this. I got no problem. I've got this. But when I have to actually articulate it and I make myself answer questions about exactly what are our goals, our needs, our objectives, our teaching methods, how are we going to evaluate, how are we going to summarize this really well, I do so much better. Don't feel it, know it. Show it, be able to show it and share it with other educators, be able to build on what you already know, really refine it, shave it down to those essentials. That's what's most engaging, because that's what's going to make you a better educator. It's going to help your students be better students in the class, and most importantly, be better providers on the road. So, gnomes. I know it's a silly little mnemonic, but it really, you can use the GNOMES mnemonic, you can use other teaching frameworks. This isn't about it being a mnemonic. It's about it being a framework for lesson plans. There's certainly plenty out there, but we had to pick one, and this is the one that I like. It's pretty straightforward, and come on, it's GNOMES. So we're going to start right at the top with goals. Goals are not objectives. Goals are what the heck is the purpose? Like, bottom line, in just a couple of words, what's our simple long-term outcome? And it needs to be those 3 things. And you can work from the bottom if you want. It needs to be an outcome. It should be long-term or big picture. And it needs to be simple. Now, if we're talking about sepsis, our goals are going to be to improve outcomes for victims of sepsis and septic shock. We're improving patient outcomes. That's the big goal. That's what we're trying to accomplish here. And that's the prize that we have to keep our eye on. But it's not about us, really. I mean, we're the ones crafting this lesson, and we're the ones often teaching this lesson. But man, who's the hero of the story? Who's the hero of our story here? It's not the septic patients. It's their goals, the students. What are their goals when they come into class? Some of them want personal advancement. They want continuing education credit. They want to just be better providers. Maybe they were told they have to take this class in sepsis because sepsis is a new thing and the hospital's got a new sepsis plan. Maybe they just want to be in class with a bunch of other people that they like or that they work with. Maybe they want to help other people who have had sepsis. They want to do better for their patients. Maybe they've got a personal connection to this. They know someone who has had sepsis and they want to be able to also share their stories. Maybe they're curious. That was how I got into learning more about sepsis. It was something that I wasn't taught in my original EMT and paramedic classes way back in the day. So I was really curious about what this sepsis thing was all about. And sometimes people are just in class to get out of the rain and the cold. But you want to consider what are the goals as best you can identify of your audience. And your goal is to align ultimately your goal of improving patient outcomes for sepsis with their goal or goals, whatever reason or reasons your groups are there. And the better you can align that, the better this whole program is going to be. And you must be able to articulate that. You have to be able to say it clearly and concisely to be able to communicate it to the class, to the people who are funding or otherwise supporting this program. We're going to help you make it happen. To other educators that are maybe going to deliver this with you or on your behalf. You need to be able to articulate it. So I'm telling you, write it down. Then we move on to needs, okay? And this is primarily the students' needs. We need to identify their point A and their point B, right? Point A, where are they now? Maybe they're unaware of sepsis-specific assessments, okay? Maybe you get that from a quality assurance program or knowing a little bit about their background of your students, or maybe you've applied a pretest, or this comes out of a regular protocol testing. There you've identified, let's say, they can only identify about 20% of sepsis cases. Well, we need to get those numbers up for the ultimate objective that we're trying to achieve, right? Excuse me, the ultimate goal that we're trying to achieve. These needs will drive our objectives to get us to that goal. Maybe they're unaware of sepsis treatment. Maybe approximately 30% of patients through your quality assurance program have identified patients who maybe even the EMS providers identified as sepsis, but didn't give fluids. Now, I'm not saying clinically speaking, fluids are the be all end all of sepsis and the like. I'm just trying to give you a concrete example of how we identify needs to drive the program. The whole point of this is not to get some facts about sepsis and convey them verbally to other people. We want to achieve something. We want this to have some kind of a meaning, and you want it to have you want your educational programs to have a functional outcome. Now, we have to be able to clearly articulate our needs. Needs are also the factors that affect learning, like patients' background, education, life experience, their culture and ethnicity. Disabilities and impediments, capacity and confidence, adult responsibilities that distract them from class. Now, one thing I'm going to put in there about learning styles. Learning styles in a lot of ways are, the theory behind learning styles is controversial. I don't want to get bogged down in it, but what I'll say about learning styles, what we do know about learning styles is if you're teaching something that's hands-on, then you need a hands-on program to do it. So much of what we do in emergency response is hands-on. That's why you're always hearing people telling you in class, well, I'm a hands-on learner. Well, everybody's a hands-on learner, quite frankly. But what we're talking about here is you want to accomplish hands-on things So you want to learn it in a hands-on way. That's how I tend to align learning styles when I'm thinking of needs. So to boil it down, what do they need to have? What do I need to give? Now, to enhance critical thinking, there are some things that students may not have encountered, and maybe skills that your other educators, maybe you yourself, haven't really brought to the forefront. But here's some things we need to do. You need to provide student wait time. There's something called the Harvard pause. When you ask a question and you let students sort of stew in it for a minute. And you're not trying to raise the temperature of the classroom. You're not trying to make people feel bad because maybe they don't know the answer. What you're trying to do is make it clear this is not a rhetorical question. So for instance, if I were to ask you, and this is rhetorical now, or you can put answers in the chat. And I should mention too, you could put questions in the chat that we'll answer as we go along. We certainly want this to be interactive in that way. But if I were to say to you, what methods do you currently use in your classroom to enhance critical thinking? And then we wait. We give people time to actually think about an answer, not just regurgitate something, not just hold off and hope someone else is going to answer. Wherever you can, you want to provide try it out time as well. Anytime they get hands-on or they get to be able to employ, whether it's cognitive, affective, or psychomotor techniques that you're trying to get across, give them time to practice it. You want students to be able to explore in the classroom, but excuse me, don't forget, we need to be able to rein in distracting discussions, and don't be afraid to focus frequently. What I like to do to bring it back so that people don't feel like they're just being cut off, even if you need to rein in those discussions, ask questions like, what have we done so far? Okay, well, why is this important? How can we use this? And questions like that help refocus the class and help you get a good idea of how the students are doing, what takeaways they're extracting from what you're putting out there, and how they're connecting with the material, things they're creating. How well are they creating? Are they working all the way at the top of Bloom's taxonomy? Are they building on some of the stuff that you're bringing up and combining it with their life experiences? Well, these are questions that'll help focus us and give you an idea of that as we go. The objectives, if the needs are sort of point A, the objectives are point B, not what they need to know. We want to focus on competencies, what they need to be able to do. Specifically, who will do what, under what conditions or with what resources, how much or how well. And when we're setting our objectives, we have to make sure that we're not making them, expecting them to leap up ladders of learning. In other words, if they're operating on the bottom of Bloom's taxonomy, if they've just memorized brand new information, okay, that you've got students who are brand new, first in a first aid class or EMT class or the like, or paramedic class, and they're learning new aspects of anatomy and physiology, and they're really memorizing, right? And trying to understand. We can't expect to then immediately throw them into a scenario that's dynamically changing, where they're going to apply information that they've just barely memorized in new and creative ways to solve problems. That's not fair to them, and it's going to wind up being a disaster from start to front. So we need to keep that in mind when we're doing our objectives. My favorite are Robert Mager's ABCD objectives, although technically he doesn't call it that. We've sort of changed it up a little bit. But again, the audience, behavior, condition, degree, and make yourself articulate exactly what these are so that the students can see it. Everybody can see exactly what those objectives are. One of the things that I love doing, and I'm very proud to get a chance to write EMT chapters in EMT and paramedic textbooks. And over the years, for the chapters that I've rewritten, I almost always begin immediately with tearing into the objectives. We want better objectives and objectives that are applicable. An example would be paramedics will use a given criteria to call a sepsis alert. And the given criteria, hopefully you've got a specific sepsis alert criteria and you can use exactly that. So we can tweak our A, B, C, D for all medical patients, or if you're teaching pediatric sepsis, you could say for pediatric patients or patients with suspected sepsis, with a minimum accuracy of 70%. Again, you can tweak these different aspects. Maybe your audience is EMTs or EMRs. Maybe the behavior, like I say, is specific criteria, or maybe we're talking about, pardon me, maybe we're talking about treatment for sepsis instead of identifying using a sepsis alert criteria. You can customize this, but I want to give you a specific example. When they've completed the program, paramedics will be able to use given criteria to call a sepsis alert for all medical patients with a minimum accuracy of 70%. Now, again, we may want to tweak this or speak a little bit more about it. Maybe people take a look at this, your students take a look at this, they say, I'm sorry, I'm reading that right? You want me to call a sepsis alert for all medical patients? No, I want you to apply sepsis criteria for all medical patients. So again, we move from objectives to the core of what we're going to do, our teaching methods. This is our path from A to B, from the needs to the objectives, so we can achieve our goal. It's going to be based on available resources that we have, your strengths, learning styles, focusing on engagement, not entertainment. And there's a man named Alan Monroe from Purdue University. He came up with this thing called Monroe's motivated sequence. And the idea is to help your students engage better with the materials. Number one, you grab their attention. Number two, you engage their need to achieve the objectives that you've laid out. And you help them satisfy that need by facilitating the education. Certainly you're going to, there's probably gonna be a little bit of talking, right? But maybe there's hands-on, there's demonstrating the proper attitude or perspective for affective domain. You want them to visualize both success and failure. If we do nothing, patients with sepsis are going to fall through the cracks in the system. And many will die. And those that don't die won't receive care in time and will have to live with the consequences, the sequelae, avoidable problems for the rest of their lives. And not just them, their families, their loved ones, their caregivers. You could visualize both failure, but of course, if we're going to do that, we want to visualize success. But through the strength of sepsis education programs like this one, we've shown that EMRs, EMTs, paramedics can improve patient outcome for sepsis patients. And that's not just improving their lives, that's improving the lives of people around them. That's saving the healthcare system millions upon millions of dollars. And then finally, action, what exactly we're going to be doing. Let's apply this. How are we going to make this work in the real world? So some examples, the way we do this to get attention, right? Sepsis kills 270,000 people in the US annually, and that's more than prostate cancer, breast cancer, and opiate overdoses combined. It's the leading cause of death in hospitals and the leading cause of hospital readmission across the board. That gets our attention and starts to set up for our needs. I'll also mention something just as a side note, something that I've tried to do more and more. A lot of times I find students taking screenshots, either live and in person or via teleconference or webinar like this, So I always try and put up the citations of wherever I'm getting information, even if it tends to be a little bit smaller and off to the side so that people can look that kind of thing up. I find that as we engage students more, we can focus better on methods that apply critical thinking, the process of actively evaluating information as a guide to observing, understanding, decision-making, and action. Now, we all know Bloom's taxonomy, and I've mentioned it before. We start at memorizing and being able to remember, understanding what we've memorized, being able to start to apply this information, to analyze that this information can have different meanings in different contexts, evaluating different approaches and creating new ways to solve problems in dynamically changing environments. And isn't that what EMS is all about? That's what emergency response is all about. So we need students operating at the very peak here of Bloom's taxonomy. Critical thinking helps us move up to the top of Bloom's taxonomy. So we need to have that. So sometimes we need to start at the bottom, right? Foundational information. Definition of sepsis is the body's overwhelming and life-threatening response to infection, which can lead to tissue damage, organ failure, and death. So what I often do is ask people to describe or define sepsis in your own words, just completely in your own words, and see what they get out. A lot of times people will say, well, sepsis is a form of infection. And you don't want to jump in there and say, wrong. It's not what it is. I try to focus on that key word here that I've highlighted on the screen, right? Response. And if they say response, if that's part of their answer, well, it's the body's response. I'll help them tweak it a little bit when I want to highlight the key areas that I want them, even in this foundational information at the bottom of Bloom's taxonomy, that will help them move further up. Response for sepsis, the idea that this is a body's responding, will help us evaluate in critical thinking. This lets me make comparisons of sepsis to, say, anaphylaxis. Now, it's not a perfect comparison. They're not the same thing, but it allows me to help students build and utilize a lot of the tools that they have for anaphylaxis that they may already understand, and help transfer that for sepsis. So one of the things that we wind up asking, of course, to help engage students more is, what's the role of EMS? Like, how does this have a meaning to me? That's something we need to make sure that we're answering for our students. Well, EMS transports 50% of the patients with severe sepsis who arrive at the emergency department, and those patients tend to be older and sicker. They tend to be more sick, but receive care more quickly when arriving via EMS. And as we all know, it's not necessarily just because somebody arrived in a bus or a truck with the woo-woos going. It's because EMS is an integral part of the emergency healthcare system, and we've hopefully activated a sepsis alert and properly integrated. Now, every hour of delay in care can increase mortality by 8%. So let's hinge critical thinking. I'm throwing numbers out there, but I don't want students to memorize this number, right? This number should not be on a test question. This number is to leverage critical thinking. Now we can talk about things like, okay, so this is more than a matter of life and death. It's not if they get some kind of sepsis care, they'll live. If they don't get sepsis care because everybody dropped the ball, then they're going to die. That's an oversimplification. If we know that it increases mortality by 8% and morbidity, it's reasonable to presume that morbidity goes along with that to some degree, then we want to make it easier for patients with sepsis to get that care earlier. So let's think about different ways we can help them get that care earlier. Now, if I was giving this as a presentation, this would be a great critical thinking point of discussion. In your system or in your systems, how can we help patients get care earlier? And then we'll start getting the critical thinking, get the juices flowing, have them help solve this problem. Don't come in as the person who's got all the answers. Now, hopefully you've got a lot of good suggestions, but I care more that you're a great facilitator with this. Maybe they talk about, well, there's sepsis alert criteria, but I noticed that the physicians don't really pay attention to it. Well, let's talk about how we can solve that problem. Or, well, a lot of times, I don't know who picks up the radio, so I get a sepsis alert and I come in and it's like nobody heard the sepsis alert. Okay, well, maybe we need to solve that problem, et cetera, et cetera. Critical thinking based off of these numbers and the information that we're giving. Not simple questions and answers. And then hit it home. EMS use of guidelines improves mortality, and EMS specific education, we know, improves patient outcomes. And that's our goal, right? We can come back to that. If you can give specific cases around which you can build your education, that also really helps highlight it for patients and helps us build more ability for critical thinking. This is my grandmother who passed away just this past March in 2020. And here she is in the emergency department with sepsis just a few months before. And here's where I would build on how I was able to identify it as sepsis early on. If family members were concerned about a lot of ancillary things, but I had a good suspicion of what it was, primarily because of getting a chance to teach this all the time. But I was determined to not be that family member. And we brought the patient in, brought my grandmother into the emergency department. And luckily, I had also taught sepsis education at this particular emergency department. So the staff already knew me. So they were pretty good with that. They were pretty good with that. But this allows us to highlight things like, well, okay, little old lady with a yet undiagnosed UTI, urinary tract infection. I suspected that's what it was. My grandmother, she wasn't getting quite the care that she needed, et cetera, et cetera. So we build a case for sepsis that's sort of the classic picture of sepsis, if you will, right? But not identified. Nobody's, she didn't have the word sepsis written on her forehead. So it could have been something that easily could have been missed by a provider who wasn't bringing their A game for assessment. And likewise, I highlighted, would highlight when I'm teaching this with this case. It's classic and the emergency department should pick up on it, but how do we facilitate that? And how does it feel for me as a family member? To give providers that perspective. Here I am as a family member wanting to make sure things get done. I mean, I work in the emergency department. I know what it's like. These are my colleagues, but still, I want to make sure that things get done. So we latch onto those affective domains, right? But then we can juxtapose this with, what if they didn't read the book? And my grandmother, pretty classic textbook presentation. But let me tell you about a kid, Willie McHugh, who was a healthy, strong, 18-year-old probationary firefighter in New City Fire Department in New York. In Rockland County. He's over by West Point. Everybody knows West Point Military Academy. That's where he is. All right. So 2 years ago in January, he comes down with the flu. And healthy, strong kid, right? The flu, should be able to fight it off. Shouldn't have to worry about it, right? Like we talk about, sometimes you hear people talking about with COVID. Well, yeah, but it doesn't really affect people this age. Well, it does. And it did. And it's more rare, granted. And it's not textbook, granted, but it absolutely 100% happens. And we don't want to miss it. In this case, Willie came down with sepsis and went into septic shock from the flu. Ultimately, Willie's shock was so bad that even though he was being cared for in the emergency department in the critical care unit, and they were giving him fluids and antibiotics and everything they could to turn around, this young, healthy 18-year-old kid became a quadriplegic. His circulation shut down so badly, and they fought so hard to reverse his shock, but it had gone too long. And his limbs lost circulation. He's a quadriplegic now undergoing ongoing physical therapy and occupational therapy to get back up and going. So it can help for critical thinking to be able to juxtapose stuff like that, build on it. Again, I'm not saying that you have to teach like me. I'm not saying you can use these cases if you want. You can talk about my grandmother, maybe you talk about somebody that you know. But the whole point of it here is I'm trying to give you examples of how we can build on critical thinking and not just throw out war stories. Oh, there's one time my grandmother was in the emergency department. Oh, there's this kid, Willie McHugh. He lives about 45 minutes away from me. Let me tell you his story. It's not about that. We keep our eyes on our ultimate goal. Like these stories better lead to ultimate patient outcomes to meet the needs of the people we're educating and achieve the outcomes. I'm trying to do all of that through selecting teaching methods, which is what we're doing now, where we take a classic textbook case, but I hopefully give it a little bit more meaning by telling you about my grandmother and my experience in the emergency department with her, and then flipping it with a case like Willie's. So there you go. Now, there are more classic ways that we can use classic methods that we have, and I've already been doing it a little bit. It's a little more of a challenge in a webinar here, but if we were person to person, I would definitely be using the Socratic method. You tell me. We present a case where the concept is illustrated and have the students work to operationalize it. In other words, they make it real. They make the connection. Ways to do that would be, say, present my grandmother's case and say, okay, so now I'm there and I can't get my grandmother into the car. Or I'm on the phone because I can't make it. I'm out teaching somewhere, right? I'm at work. And you are the provider called to Connecticut, Sherman, Connecticut, to go pick up my grandmother. Well, what do you do? And we have people deal with it that way. You know, we ask them questions. How would you do that? Well, why would you do that? What other options are there? Well, if you couldn't do that, what else might you be able to do? Build on those critical thinking questions. Ask them, what are the issues related to that? What other options are? Why have you chosen that? Can you provide evidence? You know, what backs up what you want to do? And how can we evaluate this? And we bring in the metacognition of this. And I know I'm sorry for using the $2 words here, but we're teaching them not only about sepsis. When we ask questions like, what other options are there? Can you provide the evidence? What is the strength of the evidence for what we're doing? Are we doing it because this is just our best guess? Or are we doing this because we've got rock solid research that says you need to be doing this to improve patient outcomes? And we start helping people think about those concepts. Some of the things that we do in EMS and in emergency care in general is just our best guess. That's it, man. That's it. And some of it is based on years and years of rock solid international research. We just know this. And whether you're teaching an EMT class or an ACLS class or a CPR class, man, this is the stuff I try to focus on. Yeah, people, a lot of times they want to know, what do I got to do to get in, get out, get my card, right? The 3 gets. I got to get in and get out. I want to get my card, get on with my day. Well, if we help them see things differently, hopefully they'll approach lifelong learning differently, and the way they approach patients will be different. Okay, they won't be on one track, just following an algorithm or following a protocol. It won't be textbook. Expand their ability to think. Other ways we could do this. I love using PACE to prioritize multiple ways to solve problems. Okay, what's your primary first choice to solve this problem? Usually the first thing on the protocol, right? For anaphylaxis, it might be epinephrine. For somebody who's hypovolemic or hypotensive in sepsis, it might be an initial fluid bolus, right? That's our primary. Well, what would be reasons we couldn't do that? So I'd start by asking them, why would be reasons? Oh, I don't know. the fluids are cold. This patient's already hypothermic because they're in shock, and the only fluids I have are cold, so I'm not going to want to give that. Oh, okay, that's a good one. A lot of people don't think about that. Maybe we have a little mini discussion about the importance of heated fluids, even during the summertime. Okay, for patients in shock and the like. Good. Maybe we talk about, hey, sometimes the ambulance isn't checked and stopped and there aren't any fluids, or, I'm an EMR, I can't administer fluids. So, okay, what are some alternatives there? Oh, okay, well, maybe we put the fluids that we do have up on the ambulance dashboard and turn on the defroster to warm them up. Or maybe we solve the problem by saying, well, we can't administer fluid, so let's put the patient in a shock position of, make sure we lay them down if we can comfortably do so and it doesn't impede their breathing or anything. And maybe we even elevate their knees a little bit to auto transfuse a little bit. Gives us a chance to say, well, okay, that's great, but don't impede their breathing. And if we're going to raise their knees to auto transfuse a little bit, that's been shown to work, but only in a temporary basis. They're still probably going to need fluids and maybe pressors down the road. Primary alternative, contingency. Maybe at this point we're putting in vasopressors as our contingency, and emergency plans, finally, like our absolute last ditch effort as to what we do. Well, we can't do anything else. We'll administer, administer those cold fluids. I'm not saying we do that, but maybe we decide that in an emergency, maybe some people would do it. And as you go through that, you not only get a good idea of how your students would prioritize things. Everybody regurgitates the primary pretty well, but I find that many times, especially with experienced providers, they like to jump right to, oh man, I want to show you how salty I am. Sometimes you got to do what you got to do, and we just go into the emergency planning. And I might take a pen right here, right? As we don't have fluids, and I got the part here, and I'll use this part, and I'll jab it into the patient, and I'll jab the other end in, and I'll do a fluid transfusion of my own blood. And I mean, granted, I'm being a little hyperbolic there, but if you've been teaching for a while, you've probably heard somebody try and show how cool they are by coming up with something that's absolutely ridiculous and you absolutely don't want them to do. Or, okay, if you were in an austere environment, if you had nowhere else to go or nothing else you could possibly do, and this patient needed something right now, maybe you could consider something like that, but you want to make sure that they understand how far down our priority list that is. And again, prioritize problems and solutions. Maybe you could have students list problems, list solutions, and prioritize them. EMS is all about prioritizing, right? Emergency services, scene management, it's all about prioritization. And man, if you're teaching people for the national registry tests, I write questions for the national registry tests. It's about prioritizing, okay? What's most important? And being able to identify those exceptions. When is it okay to break a rule? Why? Why would you break a rule? Why is it okay to break that rule? How is it okay to break that rule? How is the best way to break that rule? Really get into the nitty-gritty of it if you can with the critical thinking. Now in NOMS, we get to the E in NOMS, almost at the end. Evaluation criteria. Well, what we're testing them on has got to be those objectives, right? I mean, that's what you want to achieve. Did they achieve it or not? It's as simple as that. And the man, Robert Mager, who built ABCD objectives, said it really is that simple. And we start straying away from how simple that is. That's when we wind up running into issues. So we want to choose our testing instruments that are most appropriate for the objectives, right? If they're primarily cognitive objectives, then maybe a written exam is going to be the most convenient. If it's critical thinking or putting it all together, maybe we need to do simulations or scenarios. It all really depends. But when you are setting your evaluation criteria, right? When you're setting up the evaluation, whether it's for feedback or formative testing as we go, or summative testing at the end, we really need to make sure that we're differentiating between need to know and nice to know. What is critical for the students to know and be able to do? And what's just, I would like it if they also could achieve this or they knew that. What are standard practices? Man, this is the way it's done versus the way I like to see it. We really need to make sure that we're differentiating those kinds of things as we move through the programs and we're teaching, but especially when we are testing. For example, the paramedic will be able to use given criteria to accurately identify septic shock and call a sepsis alert. Maybe I present them with a scenario and I put this in the form of a multiple choice question where they pick a couple of different patient scenarios or patient bullet points, and they tell me which one of these meet sepsis septic shock criteria. Or maybe I give them a simulation. We present them with a whole patient and we have them do a sepsis alert. Or maybe I do a hybrid. I present them with a scenario, a written scenario, or a couple of them, maybe 3 written scenarios, and I want them to pick the patient where they accurately identify septic shock and then give a report to me as a sepsis alert. And I will evaluate that based on objective written criteria, not just, yeah, I think that sepsis alert was pretty good. I hope this gives you an idea. Again, I want to give you something concrete to start with, but even if I was consulting and helping you build a sepsis education program, sepsis specifically, I would still say we need to tweak this and customize it more for your audience. So I'm still, even though I'm giving you something concrete here, I would still customize this. When you're doing tests, make sure, especially if it's multiple choice, all options are viable. No joke options. That takes away from the veracity of the test. And people will chuckle for a minute and they'll think, well, is this whole test a joke? Consider adding I don't know as an option. There are a lot of different ways to take multiple choice tests and make them more dynamic and make it so you can better focus on making sure that your students are ultimately achieving their competency objectives. Formative testing as we go. Hey, give me 5 different reasons why this, I'm going to give you a scenario. I want you to give me 5 different reasons why this might be happening. Okay, so how would you respond to this scenario that I have given? Assuming I gave the students a scenario, how would you respond to it? Okay, they tell me, I want you to give me 3 or 4 more ways that you would respond. Okay, all right, let's pick one. Maybe we use them, have them use the PACE mnemonic. What's your primary, what's your alternate, what's your contingency, and what's your emergency? All right, we'll do 4. We'll focus on your primary, how you're going to do that. I want you to come back with 3 different ways to accomplish, say for sepsis. We're going to give the patient fluids. Okay, what are 3 different ways you can obtain vascular access? And I want you to prioritize for me how you would do that. Summative testing, and an example of summative testing as we go with involving critical thinking. Maybe we give them more than just a multiple choice. Maybe we have them rate chosen treatment choices according to level of recommendation or strength of evidence. Or maybe we give them a variety of different valid ways of treating the patient. But again, we have them do a primary, alternate, contingency, and emergency. Different ways of doing it. Just some different approaches that help support critical thinking. That's all. It's not all, did you memorize all of the stuff that we told you? I'm going to check on a multiple choice test. Now, as we go to another aspect of evaluation that I like, especially when we're able to provide feedback. Now, hopefully your formative testing as you go allows you to give students feedback as they go. Now, maybe it's just, here's your grade and that's it. Or maybe you give them a breakdown of, they did really well with the anatomy and physiology section, but they didn't do as well with the airway or fluid administration section. Maybe you break it down and you give them more one-on-one feedback. Or maybe you use something like we have here, the diamond method as a structure for a simulation debrief. And this starts with having the students, let's do a description. Okay, what happened? We want to set the whole debrief up. This is safe. It's a learning environment. The point of this is to give you feedback and not to tell you you did well or you didn't do well, but to keep it objective and basically what happened. Describe for me what happened. You have the students doing that. And then we transition into the analysis of where we spend the bulk of our time. That's why it's the wider part of the diamond here. We ask about what were, let's break down what you were doing, your decision-making process, what you did, what went well, why you made the decisions you did, what other options there were, again. And you want to keep the discussion positive. I mean, we're not making everything all fairy tales and rainbows and unicorns, but students usually in these debriefs tend to beat themselves up pretty badly. So you want to avoid focusing on strengths versus weaknesses, you know. Then we transition to that application, and that's, you know, this is the narrow focus part of it. At this bottom part of the diamond, I feel we're really coming to the point. We focus on moving from the stuff that we discussed to exactly how we're going to be able to apply this in this scenario, and how we can take these lessons and apply them to different scenarios. For instance, we've given numerous examples throughout today of how to apply this when you're teaching sepsis. But you could take things like the debrief diamond, right? And you can apply all of this here to any lesson that you have. And it all comes down to that summary. What's their biggest takeaway? What's their next step, and what lies beyond? And for sepsis, I talk a lot about the specific criteria, and if people have specific criteria that we need to discuss, I will discuss it, but I boil it down to this 3 o'clock in the morning rule. Infection plus bad vitals equals sepsis. Sepsis plus a patient going into shock is septic shock. And I can build on those fundamentals. And we'll talk about the specifics of exactly what we mean by bad vitals. And for some people, it'll be blood pressure or mean arterial pressure or end-tidal CO2 or lactate or whatever. We'll have taught that. But the 3 o'clock in the morning, 3 months from now rule, let's boil it down for the summary. And then we give them more resources. You know, if you want to know more about it, you want case studies to be able to teach with, well, I would go to sepsis.org right here and look for their Faces of Sepsis. Now, I work also, I volunteer as part of the Sepsis Alliance myself, and have permission to use cases like Willie McHugh's and some others that we use in teaching. You know, you certainly want permission if you're going to be using case studies and the like, but there's a ton of teaching resources at sepsis.org. If you want to ask me more questions about sepsis and teaching sepsis specifically, you can find me on Twitter, or honestly, my name is Rom Duckworth. It was a hard 3rd grade, let me tell you, to have a name like that, but I'm an easy Google. Get a hold of me. And if you want specific resources, RescueDigest.com. Just type in the word sepsis, it'll bring you to any of our resources. And there you go. So on the sepsis side, that's how you summarize. Next steps, learn more about sepsis, get the perspective of what our emergency department colleagues and our critical care colleagues do for sepsis. To learn more of the story, reach out to me for more information. That's where we go from there. And as we wrap up this program, specifically from the education side, goals. Our goals is to improve sepsis outcomes, right? Our needs. We talked about having simple and flexible systems to be able to teach in a variety of circumstances. Our objectives are based on assessment and treatment for sepsis. And that's going to be based, you know, however you do it locally. Methods focus primarily on critical thinking. Evaluation, we talked about a lot of different things building on critical thinking, but I hope that you like the debrief diamond or take away a little bit more information there. And we summarize on resources and next steps. So I hope that you found this framework useful. And even if you think that the gnomes mnemonic itself is silly, that's fine. build on the concepts. So what are our next steps? Our next steps are your questions. So if anybody's got any questions, Nate can jump in here and we can take a look and
Absolutely.
see which we got. Oh, go ahead.
Sorry. So we do have a couple of great questions that have come in just to keep this rolling with the sepsis stuff. So how, if at all, do you modify or adapt this approach for CE versus initial education?
Oh, well, that's going to be focusing on the student's needs primarily. You know, what knowledge base do they already have? If it's initial education and they've never heard of sepsis before, then it's probably going to be, I would imagine, part of a larger program. So I would draw connections to the fundamentals of shock, because sepsis is a form of shock. And focus on core concepts around assessing and treating shock, whatever's appropriate to their level, and especially how they're going to integrate with colleagues. For EMTs, how they can expect to work effectively with paramedics treating for shock. For EMTs and paramedics, how effectively they're going to be able to call perhaps a trauma alert or a sepsis alert, and what's going to happen in the emergency department when that happens. For CE, I would focus more on maybe myth busting. You know, let's start with some of the basics, and let's break apart some things that people may think about sepsis or this particular topic, and then let's tell you what the real facts are, making sure that we're backing it up, not only with wherever we can, the actual science and the research behind it, but some kind of tangible, tasteable, feelable case study or war story, if it has to be, or, you know, somebody saying, hey, you know, asking even the students sometimes, hey, who has seen this work? And helping them, that even if they say, well, I've seen problems with that thing that you're telling us to do, you want me to adjust my treatment or my care or my attitude, and here's why I have a problem with that. And that could be uncomfortable when you're teaching and they throw out something, especially if it feels kind of valid, but you need to have that stuff out in the open in order to be able to address it. The worst thing in the world, especially for CE, for sepsis or any other topic, is to have people nodding their heads through your program and knowing that when they leave, they're going to just go right back to whatever they were doing before they went through your education program. Now, if that wasn't the angle that you were looking for, or you want something that's a little more sepsis specific, I'm happy to address that. Just let me know. But I'm taking it from more the general education perspective.
Absolutely. Thank you, sir. And so the next one is actually probably a good one to expand on. So what are your thoughts about SMART objectives? SMART being the mnemonic, which I'm sending in the chat just in case there's anyone out there who doesn't know the different letters, with specific, measurable, achievable, relevant, or time-based objectives. Do you have any thoughts on that SMART objectives?
Yeah, absolutely. SMART is those are great attributes for objectives. I'm trying to keep it as focused as I can. I would say you want to start with your audience, behavior, condition, and degree. Focusing, aiming all of those towards a competency. What do you want them to be able to do? In what way are they going to be different in their capabilities after the education program that you've run, after the lesson that you've taught? And then once you've built that, take a look at the objective that you've written. The student, you know, after this program, the student shall be able to, audience, behavior, condition, degree. And then look at it and go, okay, let's fine tune this. Is it specific? Is it measurable? How are we going to be able to test this? Is it achievable? Are we going to be able to do this? Or is this a leap in learning from where they're starting out here and I'm expecting them to be way, way up here? Is it realistic in the real world, realistic and relevant to them? And time-based, I tend to think of as is this time-based, teachable and testable within the time frame we're working in. So SMART objectives, absolutely. Really, it's a way to fine tune the audience, behavior, condition, and degree, those 4 elements that you need.
Wonderful. So far, I think we've addressed all of the questions. We do have a couple of minutes left in case anybody wants to chime in at the end here, get their questions and comments in. But again, I will be including all of this contact information that's up on the screen right now. That will be sent out in the follow-up email to everyone in attendance. So you will be able to get in touch with Rom or get some of these resources off the websites listed here, so that we can kind of continue these conversations outside of just this webinar time. I just sent a link in the chat for everyone in attendance. You'll be able to go to the NEMSI website and register for CE for today's presentation. I so far have not seen any questions come in, so I think that we have addressed everyone's questions and comments so far. Do you have anything that you want to say before we go ahead and wrap things up? I really appreciate your time today.
No problem. Honestly, I started my career a little more than 30 years ago. I was in chemical engineering school, and I found that wasn't really for me. And I kind of, through a first aid class, wandered into emergency services and didn't know anybody in it, and sort of found my passion. And now 30 years later, I found what I enjoy the most about emergency services is I really have a passion for teaching it. I love teaching, and I love teaching about teaching. And so thank you so much for giving me the opportunity to talk about some of this kind of stuff. And if anybody wants to talk about this stuff, I love building on it and learning on it and sharing with other people. So thank you for teaching. I hope some of these tools that I've picked up along the way are useful to you. Through more difficult times for emergency responders, and I think especially the magnificent subset of emergency responders known as educators, it's super difficult for us right now. And I realize that. I want you to know that we're all out there. We're pulling for you. I'm pulling for you. I love you. Stay safe, stay warm, and keep up the good fight. Thank you very much.